Okay.
Okay, we are starting now with the paper by Peter, Trade Disruptions and the Organization of Supply Chain. We will try to go in a slightly accelerated pace, so 20 minutes, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Stand here. I hate sitting.
Open that?
I'm burning up valuable time.
No, it's
Okay, I'll sit. It's okay. Okay, so thanks for having me. This is joint work with Sebastian and Georg, who are over here, and Justin Pierce, who's in California somewhere. No, just for today. Like, he didn't move to California. He's just, yeah. Penny's a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. And they told me to talk really, really fast, which I'm going to avoid doing. I'm just going to use less words and talk normal. Okay, so I would say the goal of this presentation, it's a very long paper, it's very involved, and our goal here at the slides is just to give you a taste of what's going on in the paper, and you can always go read it. And I would say we began thinking about this paper in the more hopeful era, when we were thinking about trade disruptions declining, but over the course of the paper's evolution, it's the other part, which is when trade disruption probabilities are rising, that it's maybe becoming more relevant. Okay. So we're going to use census data, standard disclaimer. I don't really have to do much motivation here because Penny already motivated it. There's lots of reasons we're interested in global value chains, and recent events put those chains at risk. And it's important to understand, for all the reasons we just discussed, what that disruption might entail for firms, countries, et cetera, different constituent groups. And what we tried to do in setting up this paper was to focus on a different set of firm behaviors than is kind of more typical in the literature. So in the literature, there's a lot of work on integration, firms purchasing other firms in order to establish a supply chain. But there are many instances where that's not possible. And if you think about one of the periods we'll study is US-China integration, where ownership restrictions kind of inhibited full integration. And so our goal was to think about other ways in which firms might knit together a value chain. And we're going to call those other ways the choice of a procurement system. And we're going to think about specifically, so there's many choices one might make in trying to model this. And the way, and the model can't do everything. So the way we thought about this was, let's compare two different strategies for procurement, which pop out of a model that I'll talk about in a few minutes, which are very stark. So you can think of the first bullet there is kind of the spot market approach, or we're going to call it the A system in a second. That's when firms will buy from a given buyer will buy from a seller on the spot market. And the buyer is buying an input in the particular context. In this case, it's a quality control problem. So the buyer wants a high quality input for whatever purposes they're going to use the input for. But it's possible that the seller might try to send a low quality input to that provider and cheat and kind of make higher profits. So in the simple system with the spot market, a firm wants an input, goes out in the spot market, gets the cheapest input, and then performs a costly inspection to make sure that the good fits the bill. A second alternative is a relational contract, a relational procurement system. And in this case, what the firm does is when it purchases that input, it provides a little bit of an extra payment, which is an incentive for the seller not to defect, right? And the idea is that incentive payment, kind of the present discounted value of that incentive payment over a long relationship will prevent the seller from wanting to get the one-time profit from deviating. And so you can already see there's one very stark, spot market purchases, second is relational, and then you can see where we're going in terms of trade disruption, because what's going to be really important in that incentive premium is the probability that the relationship might break up. If there's a low probability the relationship might break up, then the amount you have to pay the seller not to deviate is smaller than if there's a high probability of it breaking up. And that's how we're going to take into account trade disruption. Good? I guess we don't have time for questions, so I keep saying good anyway. All right, so we're going to call one A and one J, and you'll see that's because the paper, the kind of very nice model we're going to build upon, called A, the American system, and called the second one the Japanese system. Why? That paper was written in the 90s, and that paper was looking backwards to the 80s and thinking about keiritsu in Japan and just-in-time and all the Japanese management practices that are now kind of talked about a lot, but back then were kind of new. And then the other system is known as the American system. Okay, so as I mentioned, the paper has a bunch of stuff. We have theory in two parts. The paper is kind of bookended by theory. First, we start with a simple model to motivate empirical work. That's not a fully GE model. And the amount the buyer is going to want to purchase in that model is fixed at Q. In the last part of the paper, we kind of drop the model we develop in the first part into a kind of Eaton-Cordham framework, and then everything is endogenous, or so pretty much everything's endogenous. And in the middle, what we try to show is that you can use the theory to kind of develop some interesting measures in the data. Those are interesting in their own right, we think, but then also we can use those measures to kind of show that the model we set up is relevant, like you actually see these procurement patterns as expected. And I think we provide the first evidence that that's the case. Okay, so let me give you a taste of how the model works. So there's this great paper, Taylor and Wiggins, 1997 AER paper that had a model of domestic procurement. And kind of the first two bullets summarizing what I've just said, but repetition is good. So the buyer, we have a buyer and a seller in this model. The buyer orders an input from a supplier, but doesn't observe the quality. And then what the buyer's problem is to choose the optimal quantity to the kind of shipment patterns, and then for each system, and then choose the system, American or Japanese, or A versus J, which is optimal. So in the Taylor-Wiggins paper, they show that the optimal contract could be one of the two strategies that are listed here. A, they call it American. J, they call Japanese. From now on, I'll just call it A and J. So to repeat, under the A system, that's the spot market system. The buyer chooses the lowest cost bidder. You pay a fixed inspection cost when the good arrives. We're going to simplify it in our setup of the model and just make that one to deter cheating. And there's no bargaining power on the part of sellers in this model. And the J system, there's no inspection, but you pay a little bit extra to the supplier in order to give them an incentive not to defect. And what you're going to see emerging from this is under A, an implication is that you might have many potential providers of your product. So every time you need the input, you go out in the spot market and you grab it from the cheapest bidder. And that might mean over time you have many different suppliers. In J, because you're giving this incentive premium, you're going to focus on one or, in reality, maybe a small number of sellers. Okay, and what we do with respect to Taylor and Wiggins is we make it international procurement as opposed to domestic. In Taylor and Wiggins, there's no probability of a relationship breaking up. But if you start applying this to an international context, as we've been talking about, there is a probability of trade disruption. If you're a trade economist, that could be a trade war. That's Trump being elected, increases the probability that trade with China might be disrupted. It could go the other way. You could have trade liberalization that reduces uncertainty. And so putting that into the model makes it a model of international procurement as opposed to domestic, and that's kind of where we go. Okay, so it's just a little bit of a visual for what we have in mind. The y-axis in this figure is inventory levels. So over the course of a year, think of T as being year. The buyer is going to order a certain amount of inputs, call that Q. And then what the buyer chooses optimally for each system, and then chooses the optimal system, is a shipment size. So given fixed Q, once you've chosen X, you've now determined the shipment pattern because you'll get X symmetric, you get the Q over X symmetric shipments over the course of the year. And those dashed lines are just the inventory of the firm running down. Every time it gets to 0, there's another shipment of X, and then it runs down to 0. And then the firm does this the next year, and then kind of over time, right? And so if this is the J system, which is the relational system, you'll be repeating these orders with the same or a very small number of sellers over the course of time. So buyer's going to choose X to maximize the present discounted value of the systems. You can think of the two different costs of each shipment, A and J. So they overlap in the sense that in the model, to make it simple, there's a high quality and a low quality good as opposed to a continuous range. Producing the higher quality good on the part of the seller is more expensive. So that's theta upper bar, which is higher quality. There's also a fixed cost of production. And then the way that these models differ is in terms of the last term. In the American system, when the shipment comes in, there's an inspection cost, a fixed inspection cost. For the J system, as I've already mentioned, there's an incentive payment, and that incentive payment is proportional to the probability that the trade will be disrupted, which you could think about as the probability that a trade war emerges. But it could be other things. It could be shipping disruptions, could be whatever you like. So from the buyer's point of view, the choice between A and J is a trade-off between these inspection costs and the incentive premium. Okay. So I'll walk you through a couple implications of the model, and then I'll talk about the data and then the more general version. So think about the order size. So the buyer is choosing, it's going to order Q for the year right now. Q is fixed, and the buyer chooses the order size. If you choose, the buyer chooses a higher X, a bigger order size, there's less shipments every year. And if they choose a smaller shipment size, there's more shipments every year. So under the A system, there's a fixed inspection cost. And in order to kind of minimize the payment of that fixed inspection cost, under the A system, you have bigger shipments, right? Because you want to have that fixed cost incurred less. Under the J system, you're trying to provide an incentive to the seller, and the incentives, the seller is going to like that if you provide kind of more steady payments over a smaller number of shipments. All right, so the order size under the A system is larger, X is larger. Prices go the other way, and the reason for that is simply that the seller gets marginal cost under the A system, under the spot market system, but the seller gets that incentive premium in the relational system, in the J system, and so the prices have a different ordering than the order size. Good? Okay, so A and J is kind of worked out in the Taylor-Wiggins thing, so in the paper already, and what we're going to add to this is an empirical investigation. I think trade data is uniquely suited to this because we can observe the buyers and sellers in a way that you can't often do in domestic. One thing we don't observe, even in the international data, are the contracts that are between the buyers and sellers under either system. And so what we're going to have to do is use, through the lens of the model, the attributes of the procurement system to kind of identify who might be an A buyer in the US data, we're going to use US trade data, and who might be a relational buyer, a J buyer. Okay. Second implication of the model is that, as I've already said, I'll say it again, is that the J system incentive payments depend on the probability of trade disruption. But the A system doesn't depend on that. Let's say if it's in a trade context, doesn't depend on trade policy. So changes in trade policy are going to have an impact on the system that buyers choose. And one of the things that we're going to look at is an era not of what we've been talking about, which is when the US and China aren't getting along, but we'll go back to the year 2000 when the US and China were getting along. And there was a big reduction in the probability of a trade war when China joined WTO and the US extended permanent normal trade relations to China. I think there's another paper to be written in a couple of years when we have more data about both the kind of when things go the other way, when the probability of trade disruption rises with Trump's election or with Trump's first round tariffs or with April 2025. Okay. So what data do we use? What data could you use? What do you need from the data? And then how would you use it? So we'll use transaction level US import data. We see all the good things you might want to see. Who's the buyer? Who's the seller? What's the value? What's the quantity? Value over quantity will give us the unit value. That allows us to look at something like the price under the two systems. And we know when things are arriving, when they left ports. And we need to come up in these data with the notion of a buyer. But these data are very rich. So you have M's. M's an importer identifier in the US trade data. But importers can buy many different kinds of products, H, and they can come from many different countries, C. And even within that, MHZ triple, they could come by different mode. And we know that stuff that might come by air is different than stuff that might come by ship or truck. And so we're going to call a buyer a quadruple of that thing. So every time I use the word buyer, I'm just meaning one of these quadruples. In the paper, I won't have time to talk about it today, we can also look at quintuples, which are buyer-seller pairs. And that would be MX, X for exporter, HCZ. Okay, but I'll focus on buyers. And what we're going to try to figure out is how could we identify in the data a buyer that's using the A system versus the J system. And then if we can do that, do the patterns we identify with A and J, match up with what the model suggests. And then if we look at an era when the probability of trade disruption goes down, do we see anything like switching going on between the A system and the J system that I set up on the previous slide? We can also bring in firm level data that come from the census. The only thing I'm really going to mention today is inventories, because there's an inventory implication to what we're talking about as well. Okay, so how do you classify importers as A and J? Remember, we don't see the contracts, so what can we do here? We're going to use the model in helping us here, and then we're going to kind of check. So under the A system, as I said before, buyers might receive a shipment from many sellers because they, in the lens of the model, they go out to the spot market. So whoever is idiosyncratically lowest at the time of that bid will win the order. But J, you keep going back to the same firm or to the same group of firms, small group of firms. So for every buyer, what we can look at is what SPS, the ratio of sellers per shipment. So SPS is sellers per shipment. It's just the number of suppliers. So you look at a buyer. A buyer has a begin and an end period. So we're going to do this, let's say, for the longest interval for one of our sets of results. And we can do it for subperiods and others. You're just asking how many suppliers were there per number of transactions that the buyer conducted. And it's bounded by 0 and 1. And if it's 1, it means that there's a different seller for every transaction that you went through. That's a very A, spot market. And if it's 0 or approaches 0, then it's like you have very, very small number. Okay? And then we can keep in mind that the higher that ratio is, the more likely you are to be A. And we're going to exploit that. So we're going to use that dimension of the data to identify who's A and who's J. Here's the distribution of what that looks like across all the buyers that we can identify from 96 to 2016. And there's a lot of spread, so it goes from 0 to 0.8. Kind of interesting. And then if you're up there, you're more likely to be A. And if you're down there, you're more likely to be J. Okay? We can do this in various ways. I'm going to show you regressions where we just throw SPS on the right-hand side. But if you wanted to, you could just take, let's say, the top 10 percentile and the bottom 10 percentile of SPS and make that discrete. Just call those A and call those J. Everything we find works out all the different ways that you do it. So let me give you now a taste of whether or not this makes sense. First, what we can do is for all those quadruples, MHCZ, those buyers, we could average across countries, or we could average across products, like the countries from which the US is buying and the products that are US buying. So like just kind of a smell test. Do you see something you might expect? And you do. So here's the average across countries. We'll give you the top 10. And reassuringly, J, Japan, shows up as one of the more Japanese suppliers. But also Mexico, and that also could make sense, especially if you think about the products that show up, which is transportation. So remember, when Terrell and Riggins motivated their paper, they were thinking about Japan. In particular, they were thinking about Japan auto production, but also other industries. And so it kind of makes sense that it shows up in something like transportation. Okay, there's lots of other things you can do. You could look at the identity, like the industry of the buyer in the US. You could do things like that. Those are all in the paper, but in the interest of time, we'll skip. So first point at this slide is like, yeah, you scratch the surface. It seems like this measure makes sense. Second thing we can do is we can now say, do those attributes of procurement, the shipment size, the unit value, and the frequency of shipment, do they line up with this measure of A and J? So one way to think about this is we use some of the data to define A and J, and then we ask whether that's consistent with the other things we can see about procurement, right? That's one, right? So, but you could have done it, you could do it other ways around. What we're basically doing here is showing there's a consistency between these different attributes. But we like the way we did it because sellers per shipment is something that's easy to see in lots of transaction level trade data. So it's a measure that's, I think, broadly applicable for other purposes, and has been used, for example, in development papers and stuff. Okay, so in the model, A buyers get larger shipments. They come less frequently, and they're at a lower price. And so we can run a very simple kind of OLS regression where on the left-hand side, we have some outcome like size, frequency, or price. On the right-hand side, we have that continuous measure. Remember, as that measure gets bigger, you're more likely to be A. We can control for quantity, and then we have these other controls, right? If we do that, and I'm kind of going through this fast, but I think it's pretty straightforward. What do you see? As SPS gets up, goes higher. So as you're more, as we think you are more A based on the number of sellers per shipment, you have bigger shipments. That's the first coefficient. You have more time between shipments, so bigger and more time kind of makes sense. And the unit values are lower. So it kind of lines up. So there's broad consistency. So we think this is kind of the first evidence for Taylor-Wiggins, even though it's international. It's the first empirical evidence, I think, that supports that really nice insight they had. And then the thing, I'm not going to show you the regressions, but if you go back and look at the inventories of the buyers in the US data, they tend to have higher inventories, which is also consistent, because if you're getting bigger shipments and they're coming less frequently, on average, you should have higher inventories. Okay, how am I doing on time?
You are fine.
Okay, fine means...
15 minutes.
Oh, I don't even need 15 minutes. I went too fast. Okay, that's okay, more time for questions. All right, so next thing is there consistency, like if you look out in the world, and this was actually the motivation in some sense for the paper, was there's been a lot of work on the China shock. And one of the things that's interesting about, and for sure everybody here knows this, one of the things that's interesting about US-China integration was there was no change in the US tariffs that the US extended to China when it entered the WTO. The thing that changed was the removal of these annual votes that kept the tariffs at the MFN level in the US over time. They became quote unquote permanent, where permanent meant before Trump, okay? So US grants permanent access to MFN tariffs to China in the year 2000. This exposure in ways that we could talk about later if you wanted more, this varied by product, and this allows us to set up a triple diff and diff strategy. So we can ask, how do those procurement attributes, the size of the shipment, the price of the shipment, and the frequency of the shipment, how do they behave after versus before this reduction in trade uncertainty for the buyer and seller relationships that are with respect to China across the products that are more or less exposed to the change in policy? And so that's, again, a pretty simple OLS regression. We have the same, oh, I lied before. I'm going to show you stuff that's relationship-based, MX HCCDT. That first term is M is buyer and X is seller for a given HS product from country by mode of transport Z over time. And so we can look at those same three dimensions of activity. We have a diff and diff term of interest, which is an interaction of those three things. And then we have the controls that you need to identify. Okay, so again, pretty straight up table of results. One of the first row is the term of interest. What do you see in those triple differences? You see that after versus before, across those other two dimensions, the quantity per shipment goes down. So this is X in the model. The quantity per shipment goes down. The weeks between shipments goes down, so they're smaller and more frequent, and the price goes up. And so that's consistent with some of the relationships that pre-existed PNTR. So because it's MX and we have these fixed effects in there, we're looking at that intensive margin of relationships. And what that shows is that some of those relationships, or on average those relationships, look like they moved from something that was the A system to something that was the J system. In the paper, which is consistent with the lower probability of trade disruption that we posited. In the paper, we can also look at this at different levels. You can look at who becomes, like what relationships enter post-PNTR versus existed before. And there's various ways of doing that with different sets of fixed effects. And we find across the board that the evidence seems to suggest there's this movement from A to J. And so if you think about the current period, what we're thinking about would be, all right, now we move to an era where the probability of trade disruption has gotten higher. And we would expect, if through the lens of the model, and if the model is relevant, we would expect to see the reverse, right? But the tricky thing now is here we had this nice experiment in some sense where you had one country changing very dramatically for the US. What's going on now in the real world is like it's changing maybe for everybody, maybe differentially. It's a bit hard to identify. But in 5 years, we'll know more about how to do that, and people will run, hopefully, similar regressions. Maybe we will. Okay, so the last bit is, all right, so now we're going to take the whole model that we developed in the first part, we'll drop it into an Eaton Quarter model, and then we'll do the usual thing of playing around with counterfactuals. So the two big things to know about dropping it into the model are, one, now Q is going to be fully endogenous, which is kind of satisfying. The second is that there's a challenge here relative to EK. Because of our fixed costs, we have these downward sloping average and marginal costs with respect to Q. And so we have to come up with some way of doing that that's different than EK. And Baumol has this, and authors have this nice paper about contestable markets, which is kind of extending Bertrand when you have increasing returns to scale. So we kind of use that in the model as well. Of course, a lot more details in the paper. And so if you think about an Eaton and Quarter model, which has become kind of like a kind of core of the new kind of quantitative stuff that's being done in spatial and trade, where the source of heterogeneity in EK is productivity by product and country, we're going to be adding two more sources of variation And the important one now is this bilateral parameter, which is the probability that your trade could be disrupted. So somebody like a politician gets elected and increases the probability of a trade war. What's that going to do? The firms are going to react to that, especially the firms in the long-term relationships, especially the sellers in those long-term relationships who will now be, who will now demand a higher incentive payment. Actually, you were wrong. I ran out of time. Okay. So,
I don't have my glasses on.
okay, so anyway, it's easy. I have just a minute left. Okay, so then now the comparative advantage is going to depend on all three of these things. All right, and so we have three different, let me just say this stuff. We have three different counterfactuals in the end of the paper, and we, of course, take you through the usual thing of where the parameters come from, et cetera. Lots of detail on that. But the counterfactual that we thought might be most interesting these days is exactly the one I just stated, which is that suppose what happens from the point of view of the United States is that there's an increase in the probability of a trade war with every trading partner, okay? And so what does that, let me skip this. What would that look like? So the first panel is just, okay, we're gonna let the probability of a trade war decline. Probability of a trade war is going to rise, and what's going to happen is that the amount of J imports is going to fall. That makes sense, right? As the world becomes less certain, J is going to be less attractive. What surprised us was that we set up a model where you have the US, you have three countries, the US, rest of the world, and China. And China and the rest of the world are different in the sense of probability of a trade war in the calibrated version of the model. And what happens when you increase the probability of a trade war with all countries is that where the J trading was more prevalent, which is with the rest of the world as opposed to China, that becomes less attractive. So J system with the rest of the world, let's say US, Europe, declines. And as a result, because of the combination of costs, fixed and variable costs in the model, now trade with China becomes more attractive. And so in this thing, it's kind of an odd situation in the sense that trade with China will actually grow because you've kind of moved away from this thing you really liked, which was using the incentive payments with respect to the rest of the world. And then, since that's not optimal, of course, you're going to have prices rising. Okay, I feel like I did that way too fast given the amount of time we spent coming up with that counterfactual. But in the interest of time, what do I want you to take away from this? You can think about the world and relationships in terms of integration. Or you can think about other ways that firms knit themselves together with these relational contracts. And those contracts are very sensitive to the stability of the trading regime. And as the stability of the trading regime changes, you're going to see changes in how firms order goods, and in particular, the prices that those goods will arrive at. And we think that that's kind of a really important thing to think about, especially in the current era. Thank you. I went too long, sorry.
No, but I didn't say it. So Maggie Chen is going to give the discussion.
Use this. Control. Okay. Great. Thank you so much for having me. In my view, this is the perfect read if you want to understand how trade disruptions will affect global value chain through firm-to-firm relationships. You know, a core message from Penny's keynote. And I was like, this is the perfect paper to follow the keynote because that's the paper, what the paper is about. So, just a quick overview. I'm not going to repeat the main finding or the main framework of the paper, but I really like how the paper highlights a novel, underemphasized margin of trade adjustments, which is how, not just how much, trade responds to the expectations of trade disruptions by integrating the relational contracting with the risk of trade. And as Pete already, very clearly presented, is about the choice by the buyers between A and J systems, right? And the trade-off here is the incentives you need to provide to the suppliers versus the inspection cost. And trade disruption risk is going to make the J cost higher by increasing role and the expected value of the relationship, or the expected incentive you need to provide to the relationship. And this is a very elegant model that really maps cleanly into the testable hypothesis the authors later examine. Now, On the empirical side, the paper offers a very clean, tractable measure of relational agreements using the sellers per shipment. And they find that PNTR with China lowered disruption risk and actually shifted the procurement system in China from A to J to more relational contracts. As a counterfactual, the paper looks at what about the potential trade disruptions across all trading partners, and they have this somewhat initially puzzling or less expected result that actually trade is going to reallocate towards China, where J system is going to be more replaced by the A system. And I think a novel insight here is that countries abundant with relational capital or specializing in relational exports are actually more exposed to geopolitical risk, which I think is insight that's somewhat different from the existing literature where we think relations actually make us more resilient. So my comments will, let's first start with the supply side. The authors very rightly focus on the buyer side trade-off, but empirically, I think it's important to account for all the supply side evolutions that happen at the same time, which will also lead to relational sourcing, but through different channels, not necessarily from the buyer trade-off incentive channel, right? As we know here, I just included one nice figure from Key and Hei showing how China's supply side have, everybody here knows, move from processing trade to integrated manufacturing, witnessed by the domestic value added increase, right? And this can potentially lead to more relational sourcing even without this mechanism focused on the paper. And there's also quality upgrading, raising the C lower bar in the model. And there is a rising supplier concentration on China's side. And all this just to say that empirically it would be helpful to have more, in addition to the time fix, and maybe we should have more, industry-specific time trends accounted for China to take care of the supply side. And then, the switching from A to J can also occur not just because of trade disruption necessarily. It can occur internally, organically, as a result of repeated transactions, right? So as I have established, transactions with the spot suppliers, and I learn more about the quality of the supplier, right, that can organically lead us to a J relationship. And I think these transitions are not necessarily driven by role, but rather the reputational and the learning mechanism that have been explored by, for example, Ryan and Tim's paper. And how would that affect our interpretation, right? So this is more just for interpreting our results to make sure it's not reflecting alternative mechanisms. Actually, on a related note here is that I also wanted to point out that in the paper, which again is the right choice, is a focus on binary choice between A and J. But I think empirically you might, at least for short term, you might see a coexistence of A and J, and how do we interpret that? And then the measure of relational agreements using SPS, which is very tractable and works perfectly with the census data we have. But I wonder, given that we're dividing number of sellers by the shipments, right? I wonder how that compares to alternative measures, right? For example, if you look at Ryan Monarch's 2022 paper, and he shows that even for the median buyer, right, the suppliers per buyer within a HS code is actually 1. Right? So I wonder how much this index, right, the SPS, is driven by the denominator, which is the number of shipments, rather than the numerator. And I think you did some robustness check with that. And also, this paper that I cited here shows that a lot of variations of the relational relationship, the relational contracts, come from the buyers rather than the supplier countries, right? It's a choice of the buyers rather than just the supplier side. And further, how intermediaries might play a role here. And we know a lot of trade goes through intermediaries. And are you able to separate intermediaries actually from the suppliers, right? Can that lead to an overestimation of relational intensity in the presence of intermediaries? Okay, very quickly, heterogeneity effects. I think this, I'll just share the slides, and this from some, industry heterogeneity you can look into because of their variations in monitoring costs, input specificity, and the switching costs. Spillover effect, I'm running out of time, so I was just curious how the PNTR can also lead to a spillover in, for example, Japan, how Japan's J system may lose when the risk between US and China falls, and that's something you can probably check. Counterfactuals, so I'm almost done. So I really like the counterfactuals you have been doing, the 2 counterfactuals you did in the paper. I would suggest maybe 2 more. One is the digital trade facilitation, e-certification, blockchain, which is, I think, in my view, lowering the inspection cost, M. So far, we have been playing with rho, the risk, but what about a reduction in M, right? Would that make A-type sourcing cheaper? And I think it's important, especially for countries specializing in A supply. And then the bilateral trade tension, Peter already mentioned this, right? 5 years from now, when we look into the bilateral trade tension, would that symmetric to the PNTR? I suspect there might not be perfect symmetry because there is stickiness in the relationship, right? So once I choose J, I probably don't want to go back to A. I might choose a different J rather than the current J. So I wonder, if we can look into that in the future. Finally, just to conclude, I think this is a very cool paper. It really gives us very important implications that I haven't thought about, at least myself, and that is relational capital can be a source of comparative advantage. And trade disruption can actually erode the value of that comparative advantage. And furthermore, countries abundant with relational capital can actually be more exposed to geopolitical risks. And what should they do? They might actually benefit more from policies that stabilize expectations to preserve that unique source of comparative advantage. And for the rest of the world, I think it's even more important to reduce the cost of relational sourcing, given the rising trade disruption risks. I'll stop right here. Thank you.
Thanks. That was fantastic. Let me take a couple of questions. Okay, so let's go in order. Yep.
So this was very interesting. I have a question also about the supplier side. So do you have any idea whether, in particular in this A mode, these suppliers can use their backlog of previous orders to endogenously adjust for like negative demand shocks? So once they break a relationship with the buyer, so do they use that? Can you see that in the data?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. So the first comment is just when I go to supply chain conferences with firms and business economists, they always talk about just in time to just in case. I think that could be the name of this paper. But my question is about intra-firm trade. So it seems like the most intense J type would be if it's intra-firm. So can you distinguish within that and see if that's true, and then also control for it, because that would seem to affect the results?
I guess you went over this quickly, but the notion of optimality here, is it just because of this sort of just-in-time? Is it more true for certain types of goods where, demand customization is really important? And kind of thinking back to this sort of resilience to shocks, is it sort of particularly important to have this kind of J type in that, and that also kind of creates a trade-off? Like it's more intensively relational on the one hand, that exposes you more to shocks to that supplier, but then on the other hand, it allows you to sort of adjust, perhaps demand shocks and customization. So I don't know, I wonder if you've thought of those things.
Great paper. I wonder if I can make my question for an example. So I go to the farmer's market every weekend, and I always buy on the spot from a certain farmer. I wonder if in your data that would look like a relationship, like J rather than A. Second is the uncertainty about the tariffs, the future availability of price, and the uncertainty about the availability of supply. Because it seems to me like in the first case, you might prefer to be an A, and then once, for example, China gets access, you become a J. But if I don't know, I'm not sure if there's going to be a supply in the market, like going back to my farmer's market example, if I want to make sure that I'll get the fresh product, I can pre-order in advance, and then I become a J, which would be a little bit the opposite of what your model was suggesting. Thanks.
Yeah. So I was curious about the price relationship. So in a large number of customs data, we see that the prices actually fall in the course of a buyer-supplier relationship. So here it's suggests different. So my question is am I thinking it a little bit different way, or is the US different in this case about the dynamics of price in a buyer-supplier relationship?
Thank you. I really like the presentations, and I like Maggie's comments too. My question is, when you run the regression, do you separate homogeneous versus heterogeneous products? Because I think it makes a difference, because relation-specific investment will matter more for heterogeneous products, particularly those GVC products. So that leads to the second question, which is that you only give the choice, a dichotomy, choice of J versus A. If the probability of trade war increases, people switch from J to A, but there's actually a third alternative, which is domestic sourcing. So if you allow firms to onshoring, will that change the model, result, prediction, and the regression analysis? Thank you.
Okay, my first question was actually related very much to this one and what Maggie said. But let me just add another dimension. You've taken geopolitical risk as exogenous. But if you look at big tech, high-tech trade, one could argue that actually geopolitical risk is not exogenous. And the classic example is Apple and NVIDIA. One can argue that, batteries and rare earths, that in those areas, the relationship strategically influences geopolitical risk. I mean, the business story today is that the US will come to an agreement with China, and the whole architecture needs to be rethought in terms of, a different sort of network with two dominant players.
Well, thank you. I think it's a great paper. I'll tell you in private all the reasons that I think it's great, but some specific questions. So first, in terms of counterfactuals, could you see what happens after the export restrictions vis-a-vis China in 2022 are announced? Because I think that's the point where China must have realized, the peace is not likely. But there could be these sticky relationships that Maggie mentioned. So I think this is something you could be doing already with the current data. Two very specific questions. So one, it was not intuitive to me why in the A system the quantity would be higher, because if I don't know the quality, if I don't trust the supplier to provide high quality, wouldn't I want a smaller shipment so that I don't waste time? So I'm sure this comes out of the model, but it was not intuitive to me. And the other one is, I know it's all conditioned on the product HS code, right? But how can you be sure that the difference is not due to quality differences? So the unit values do not capture some unobserved quality. So if I want higher quality, then I engage with a supplier whom I have a repeated relationship with, and I can trust to get a higher quality.
Yeah, neat paper. I'm trying to think through the theory. So the A option is the backstop to the J choice, and so some of these trade disruptions can also will affect both options, and so it's not clear that it will every kind of disruption may disproportionately affect J over A. So I was wondering if, especially, it sounds like actually the A goods were actually more geographically concentrated in China and some of the countries that are worried about trade tensions with. So So maybe some thoughts on sort of what are the underlying assumptions in terms of the impact of the shocks on the two options.
Good luck.
I guess I'll just try to hit some notes and we can talk more, and I'll go in reverse order. So the way we set it up, Carolyn, is that, yeah, I mean, we think there are lots of ways to think about probability of trade disruption. And so we were thinking about it in the way that we've kind of mentioned, and that might have other analogs, like, you know, relational contracting, where you have to go through some gulf where the probability of just, you know, like shipping through there might be difficult, is maybe analogous, but there are other ones you can think of that are not analogous, right? So we're covering a certain kind, but not all. And I agree that in a broader sense, you could think about other risks. For Penny, yeah, I mean, you could think about having test shipments, and then, you know, and then maybe you kind of get a reliable sense of a certain seller. But we're being very stark, which is that even if you did a test shipment, you still wouldn't be sure that the guy wouldn't cheat you the next time around. So again, like with a lot of the modeling choices you have to make, it's pretty stark. We'll have a broader discussion about quality stuff later. For the counterfactuals, that might be interesting, except, you know, the data, census data do come out with a lag. So even for 2022, we have an issue. I completely agree and thought the same thing during Penny's argument about the endogenase. So once you have a relation and contract set up, now a leader comes in and says, oh, look, we have these things set up. Or, you know, so I agree, that's not something, it's way beyond what we're doing here, and I think it's like super interesting. And I do think it's something that this emerging geoeconomics literature hasn't yet captured either, I think, which is an interesting dimension. So I'm on board, but we don't have that. Key, we look at whether things are the Rauch indicator and things like that, and it lines up the way you'd expect. So if things are more homogeneous. That's why we thought, you know, the one table I showed you with transportation, clearly very Rauch type, you know, differentiated goods. Okay. We control for we control for quantity. So there is evidence, if you look at the regression results, of like quantity discounts. I think this was your question, but I can't remember now. I'm getting a little lost. Anyway, I could talk more about the way we think about prices individually if you'd like. Oh no, that was also, anyway, I'm getting mixed up. That wasn't you, but it was someone else. The farmer's market, yeah, it could be the case that a spot market, by chance, that a firm going to the spot market constantly goes to the same seller. But then remember, we look at whether or not that indicator lines up with the other measures of procurement. And so kind of the point I was trying to make was, if what you were saying was true, if that was happening a lot, then you wouldn't see, we'd have noise and we wouldn't get any regression results. So kind of what we're thinking about that part of the paper is we're looking at the different dimensions of procurement and looking for an internal consistency. And they do seem to nicely line up the way Taylor and Wiggins had thought they would. I forget what Luke had asked, but we could, something about optimality across the different goods. We'll pick that up. We can talk about that. And Caroline, I'm now forgetting exactly what you asked. It's been too long. Intrafirm. Oh, yeah, sorry, intrafirm. Yeah. So we ignore intrafirm. So in the US, you can look at intrafirm and arm's length. So it's not contaminated in the sense that we dropped all intrafirm. So we made a choice early on. Like we could have tried to compare those flows, but for disclosure reasons and other, for now, we're just focusing on AL. So it's all driven by arm's length transactions. There's no intrafirm stuff in there. Wow, you can remember my things before I do. That's great. Well, oh, you can see my notes. And then I forgot what the first question was. Who asked the first question?
Carol.
Backlog, but we can talk later.
Oh, if there's a backlog. I mean, I was thinking the same thing during Penny's. You know, another way to deal with this risk is inventories, right? There's just a cost associated with that. So we don't have like that as a hedging strategy, but I guess you could imagine doing that. And then I thought Maggie's comments were great. And I particularly liked the emphasis you put on how the relational contracts are the most at risk in a world where the trade probability kind of is moving around. And that gets back to the point by the gentleman who left about the endogeneity. So like once you have these relational things set up, then you're subject to this kind of relational holdup, I guess, as it were. Anyway, all very interesting comments. We'll try to take them on board. And then if I didn't get to you, I'm sorry. I'll try to get you later. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, so the next paper, it's by Schymik on rare earths. I leave it to you, 20 minutes, and I will put the glasses on.
To enforce the time, okay. So I planned for 25, but I try to cut some corners here and there to land in 20. So this is joint work with Laura Alfaro from HBS and recently IDB, Harald Fadinger from Vienna, and Gidi Virananda, who is currently at NYU Stern. So let me give you a very brief motivation. So there has been like renewed interest in the effects of trade policy and industrial policy, particularly in sectors that governments or firms deem as strategic. Think about stuff that has to do with the green transition or products that are subject to geopolitical tensions. So a prime example of that is rare earth elements, or more broadly speaking, other critical minerals. And if you think about policies for those strategic sectors, evaluating the impact and effect that those policies can have can be very complicated when you think about that these products work through a global value chain, and this is areas where there's a lot of technological progress going on and a lot of R&D happening. So the big picture question that we want to give some answer in this paper to is what the effect of industrial policy that limits the global access to those critical inputs has via the global value chain. So we advance this in three broad areas: measurement, evidence, and mechanism. So in terms of measurement, what we do is we measure the use and innovation of rare earth in manufacturing sectors. So to that extent, what we do is we build an input-output table that includes rare earths, and we measure innovation in manufacturing industries that is related to the use of rare earth. In terms of evidence, we evaluate the impact of China's 2010 rare earth industrial policy, which was this adverse rare earth supply shock. And surprisingly, what we find is that this adverse supply shock actually created an expansion of innovation and exports in downstream industries outside of China that used rare earth very heavily. And because this is maybe somewhat surprising as an empirical finding, we want to explain the mechanism by building a quantitative trade model with input-output linkages that allows for directed technological change. And the key part of the story here is that because these inputs are critical, which means that they have fairly low substitutability, there's strong innovation incentives for those industries that use them, and there is biased directed technological change shifting towards rare earth, making those sectors in the end more effectively. And we can use this model to calibrate it and then also do all sorts of counterfactual analysis and say something about welfare implications. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm skipping the literature, and I still want to maybe talk a minute or two about what the economics, the basic economics of rare earths are. So these are 17 chemical elements. 15 of them are the so-called lanthanides. Then there's yttrium, scandium, and they're not rare in a geological sense. But they are rare in an economic sense because it's hard to mine them or to refine them, and they're important because they are used in many key industries that are related to green transformation, medicine, and military, and often they're fairly hard to substitute, even though they are used in very small quantities. So when we look at total requirements, so the quantity requirements are small, but substitution elasticity are also very low. So the key applications for rare earth are listed here. Is like on the one hand there is stuff that has to do with permanent magnets. So think about the motors of EVs or all sorts of other electric motors, wind turbines, and then stuff that has to do with catalysts. That is things that have to do with energy efficiency, renewables production, and so on and so forth. And then because China is a quasi-monopolist in the supply of rare earth and in their refining, and because it's very hard to build and operate a mine, supply is very, very inelastic, at least in the short run, and therefore rare earths are very susceptible to policy intervention. Okay, so a brief timeline about this history of Chinese industrial policy on rare earths. So early 2000, China emerged as the dominant supplier of rare earth to the global manufacturing industries. So that was a party strategy and culminated in a 2009 market share of roughly 98%. And around mid-2010, a series of events caused this global adverse supply shock. So China officially reduced export quota of rare earths, officially to reduce domestic prices and to combat illegal mining. Unofficially, some experts claim that the party strategy was to attract high value-added industries coming to China. That was followed by some diplomatic disputes with Japan, which caused China to unofficially suspend rare earth exports to Japan. And then in 2011, China increased the supply tensions by introducing export taxes on certain rare earth minerals and quotas on rare earth ferroalloys. So this all culminated in a WTO case, US, Europe, Japan versus China, which was lost by China in 2015. So what I show you here is price series of certain rare earth elements. So note this is a log scale. So there was a huge explosion of prices, at least over a couple of years. So think about price spike by a factor of 10 to 45. So not percent, but the prices increased tenfold to 45-fold, at least for some chemical elements. So what we want to do to empirically assess what this did to those industries is we want to measure what are the industries that are most affected. And to do that, we built this input-output table, which uses the BEA 2012 use table. So that's time-wise the closest to these events happening. And we take information from the United States Geological Survey on quantity contents of individual elements in certain key applications, and then we get price data from Asian metal because we have the quantity content and we need values, so we need to multiply it by some prices. So the supply side is mapped into other basic inorganic chemical manufacturing, which we essentially split into 6 rows. So there are 5 chemical rare earths that we use, plus one large others remaining sector that has nothing to do with rare earth. And on the using side, we match the applications at something that the Geological Survey calls general applications. So that is a big buzzword for them. So for us as economists, this is more like upstream, fairly upstream inputs. So these are magnets, alloys, batteries, catalysts for cars, and fluid cracking, so chemical catalysts. And there's so the BA table doesn't have a magnet sector, so we need to create one from splitting other fabricated metals into magnet stuff and non-magnet stuff. So just a quick run through how we built this table. So with the table at hand, we want to estimate the differential effect that this policy had on the manufacturing sectors, both within and outside of China, look at the 50 largest countries in the world in terms of GDP, manufacturing industries, and a long-run sample between 2022 and 2018. And the outcomes is innovation, so patents in rare earth-related technologies, and growth in exports. And the intensity of those industries is a mix of the IO table that we construct and an index of how hard it is to substitute the rare earth. So it's an index of rare earth complementary that is based on chemical and geological properties of those elements. So that's the type of regression that we run. So it's a diff and diff, where we compare change in economic activity before and after the supply shock. So that's what this post-T dummy does, between more or less rare earth intense industries. And this measure of rare earth intensity, sensitivity, is this it looks a bit like a shift share instrument, but it's a treatment indicator, which multiplies the total requirement that we get from the IO with the complementarity index that we get from the geological literature. Okay, measuring technological change is another big step that we needed to do in this paper. So we look at all patents worldwide that are granted that mention rare earths and their keywords, title, or abstracts, allocate those to countries based on these assignees, years based on the granting date, and then we use a large language model to kind of really understand whether this is a technology that is patented to either make the use of rare earth more efficient or help to substitute away from it, or to substitute to something that is cheaper. So let me show you maybe one example, because we are short on time. So this is a patent by GM. It's a US patent, and it's something about EVs. So what they patent here is a technology that uses less dysprosium to coat the magnet. And the nice thing is that patents often have their like a background section, and what they do here is they mention this cost impact. So they say, okay, the only rare earth mine in the United States that is there, so this is Mountain Pass in California, so that's not what they write, but that's the only mine that there is, that doesn't have any significant amounts of dysprosium, so it has a significant cost impact if they have to import that. Okay, I'm gonna skip that in the interest of time, and just show you like the event study graph. So here we compare industries outside of China that are in red, either very much using rare earth versus the other industries, and you see that with the supply shock, a wedge opens up, and you see much more innovation happening in rare earth intense sector. So this is also what we see when we run the difference in difference. So the first column is all countries that are not China, then the US, Europe, Japan, and all bunched together. So essentially you see it for all countries that we have in the sample, but you don't see it happening in China. I mean, there's a positive effect, but it's indistinguishable from zero. So this is an innovation response happening in the rest of the world in response to the supply cut in China. So there's no such innovation incentives happening in China, so we don't see that. So what we do then is we look at how those sectors expand or contract in terms of exporting. So there's the same event study graph, but now we look at outside of China exports comparable between rare earth sensitive industries and other industries. And again, we see that actually those sectors that are negatively affected by the supply shock are doing fairly well and exporting more compared to comparable industries in the same countries. And that's also what we find in the diff and diff. So let me do a very quick backdrop and then give you a flavor of the mechanism. So in terms of directed technological change, we found that patenting increased in affected manufacturing industries outside of China. And we do not find that happening within China. And similarly, we do find similar effects in terms of exports of those industries, which we don't find in China. We do all sorts of robustness. I don't want to go deep into that in the interest of time, and rather spend the remaining couple of minutes on the model. So the model is a GE model that combines directed technological change with two production factors. So if you want, is like a Acemoglu static directed technical change model with a Caliendo-Paro workhorse model with two production factors. So there's a factor which is local, like we call it labor, and rare earth, which is international, so it's imported from China. China is the only supplier, and value added in each tradable good is produced with those bundles of those two input factors, and those input factors are endogenous to research efforts. So in the end, comparative advantage here is shaped by standard Heckscher-Ohlin forces and directed technological change, and then on top of that, you might have propagation via input-output linkages, because some of these products in manufacturing goods are used by other industries. So this is what you see here in equations. So that's the CES bundle, how value added of a tradable good is produced. So it's produced with this RIS bundle of rare earth inputs and LIS bundle of labor inputs. And I just want to highlight two key parameters here. So first, there is this elasticity of substitution between rare earth and other stuff. So that is what we think is very low, because it's a critical input. It's hard to substitute. And then we have this classical factor intensity that we know from Heckscher-Ohlin model, which is the gamma that you see here in blue. It's like how rare earth intense is industry S. And then in the second line, you see how this adds up when you add material input-output linkages. Okay, so how is innovation done in this model? So very quickly, so these input bundles are produced via intermediate firms. They are doing some static profit maximization. So they use the raw input, like raw rare earths, raw labor, and they hold a patent and they die after a period, and they maximize the profit given the factor price for this raw input. And this determines, because of their free entry, so this is like a Krugman model, and the mass of those firms determines the states of technology. That's these ARIS terms and the ALIS terms. And on top of that, you can have innovation externalities. Think of it like building on the shoulder of giants, or you have decreasing returns to scale in innovation, for example, because ideas are getting harder to find. So these sort of things. So how does an export tax that China introduces on rare earth affect this? So this is creating a wedge in these relative factor prices between what is happening within China, where the relative price of rare earth is going to fall, and outside of China, where it's increasing. And this induces an innovation response, and this direction and the strength of this response depends on the elasticity of substitution. And if it's a complementary input, then an increase in the rare earth factor price induces an innovation response towards rare earth. And depending on how large these innovation externalities are and how intense the industry is using rare earth, this can shift comparative advantage of those sectors, as we have seen in these exports data, actually towards those sectors, even though the factor price of rare earth has increased, because the innovation effect sort of outweighs the negative factor price increase. And then again, on top of that, you have IO spillovers. So ultimately, it's a question of quantification, and you need to bring those models to the data to make some more realistic statements. So I'm going to skip how we do that, just to highlight one thing. So we really need these elasticity of substitution. Typically, you get that from expenditure shares on input for rare earth. There is no such data, but the nice thing is that the model gives us a way to estimate it from looking at the direction and strength of the innovation response in response to the change in the factor price. So if that moves in the same direction, that's a strong hint that it's actually a complementary input. And with that, we can then use our IO table to back out the factor intensity that was the gamma that you know from Heckscher-Ohlin models. Okay, and by and large, this makes sense. So for a lot of industries, we have complementary inputs, so this elasticity is smaller than 1. The ranking also makes sense. So transport equipment, that would, for example, include electric vehicles. And we have like a negative correlation between how complementary, how large this elasticity is and how intense it is. So sectors where it's critical in terms of substitution also use a lot of rare earth, which strengthens our impact of this tax. We then back out the strengths of these export tax by looking at price data from China and consider two variants of this model. So one, we say, okay, that's the baseline, what we think happened in the world. So technologies can evolve endogenously due to directed technical change. And the other version is a version where technology actually is static. So countries are stuck with their technologies. So first, what you see here is innovation response across sectors. So you have strong innovation response towards rare earth technologies in those sectors that rely a lot on rare earth, while you see a shift of innovation away from rare earth in those sectors that actually don't use it. And with that, we can look at things like impact that this policy had, for example, on GDP. So the red thing is like the bad scenario where technologies are stuck, so countries cannot adjust, and the blue bars are like what we think that happened. So here we see endogenous technologies evolving, and what you see here, yes, China did win from this policy, but a lot of this supply shock has been actually mitigated by directed technological change. And if you look at what this implied for the other countries in the world, so the losses are almost like indistinguishable from zero. So ballpark 0.01, 0.02% of GDP. And that's also reflected in welfare data. Okay, so I see here I have 0 minutes left, so I would leave it at that. So we have studied this industrial policy in rare earth. We find that it created a big push of downstream innovation due to directed technological change. And we think that this mechanism has policy implications that is beyond rare earth. So for example, when you think about sanctions, they can actually sometimes backfire. So for example, US restrictions on exports of NVIDIA AI chips have created strong innovation incentives for China to develop their own AI that needs less of these chips and all these sort of things. Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. The discussion is Caroline Fisher, and I'll give you also, I'll eat up some of your time as well.
Okay. Thanks, Jan. This is quite an impressive paper. I really think there's been a lot of meticulous work and many dimensions to get these new insights. So I'm super impressed. The paper goes through first their data innovations with a new input-output table to understand how rare earth elements transmit through the economy and get an index of complementarity among sectors. Then all that work on patents, categorizing those that enhance the efficiency of REE use or basically are REE saving. And then they use sort of theory-founded estimates of RE elasticities of substitution to inform the quantitative model to look at the effects. And some of the effects are quite striking. I mean, first of all, we do see that REE-sensitive downstream industries do more REE-saving innovation outside of China, which is what we would expect. And then they find that there's actually higher export growth in RE-intensive industries outside of China as a consequence. That's kind of, I think for me, that's kind of a surprising result that would be interesting to dig into more. And then they find that there's likely a modest welfare gain in China but in part to just the export tax revenues, so capturing some more rents. And this is moderated by endogenous technical change. Just so the induced innovation hypothesis goes back almost 100 years to Hicks. So basically arguing that if we see a change in the relative prices of the factors of production, then so an increase in the relative price is going to spur you to innovate, to economize on the use of that factor. In environmental economics, so I've my former colleague from RFF, Richard Newell, from his dissertation, was testing the induced innovation hypothesis, looking at air conditioners. At that point, he was like digging through old Sears catalogs, and so it's really amazing how far we've come with data now. And then we have directed technical change. I get to this literature more later. I was a latecomer with the environment and directed technical change work. But Asimoglu et al. Make, it's a nice point. That's not just this relative price effect. There's also market size effect that determines sort of the relative benefits for profitability of innovation, and in particular direction, and also this relative direct productivity effect. And so from the last one, this is where you get some path dependence in addition to scale effects. So you can have innovation path dependence. In that article, they also point out that exhaustible resources matter too, and so one can to think about whether these minerals and rare earth elements have sort of dynamics that of their own extraction to think about. But I think directed has a couple meanings. One is sort of in which direction is technical change going. The other is policymakers can direct technical change. And so one of the things they showed is that policy interventions, even temporary ones like R&D subsidies, can actually steer the direction of technical change and jump you to a new path. So a question I'm sort of puzzling over is like, what kind of technical change is China trying to direct here? I would think the goal is downstream industrial development. So restricting exports in these elements lowers input prices for domestic downstream industries. And so, of course, for them, you wouldn't expect input saving innovation, which is what you're focused on with the patent thing, but rather innovation input using industries. And so it could be interesting to look at growth and patenting for RE intensive product innovation or other kind of downstream things. You kind of see this in batteries. This is a time period where there's really dramatic innovation in batteries, and China really starting to dominate the patent sphere there. So I think that could be interesting to look at. One thing I had a little hard time in the paper is I think we're going from, really granular data towards more aggregated, and so I wasn't always clear on sort of which industries are showing up as RE sensitive, and also then how do we think about innovation responding along the supply chain? So not just in those like most in like the batteries or specific parts or chemical innovation, but then like vehicles. Choosing to innovate and using batteries or other substitutes. So, I think it's quite amazing the sort of magnitude of welfare effects you get from these tiny little elements that do show up as important and intensive in these industries. So I think a little more information on thinking about how. With your I/O table, sort of like how they propagate through the economy and how innovation responds. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, let me take maybe 3 or 4 questions only. Okay, let's start from this side now. Peter?
I thought that was super cool, and I was wondering if you took China's perspective, and the model went by too fast for me to figure this out, but could you invert the model to figure out what China could do to suppress technical change abroad? Like, what would they have to, like, anyway, is there a way to industrial plan that as well?
Yeah, I really like the paper. Second time hearing, still really like it. So I was wondering if the role of the subsidies on the, on the other side has been taken into account. I'm thinking about, companies like Nairon Magnetics, which really, recently came to the spotlight, invented this, RE-free magnetics, born out of University of Minnesota. And they receive subsidies for the last few years. Of course, for your time frame, it might not be a big issue, but it would be good to rule out the role of the subsidy on the demand side.
So I take this last three. Yeah.
So my, yeah? Clarification on the empirical result, which follows actually from what Caroline's presentation was. You said there was no effect on Chinese innovation, but all the others was. Is that because Chinese innovation in rare earths was already at such a high? Because my impression on following the innovation policy in China and its technology development in rare earth is that they are actually amongst the leaders. And they've had a pretty high level. And is it that you didn't get anything because there's no change afterwards? Or is it that they are actually not doing anything?
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so very nice paper. I was wondering if there's an alternative theory behind this, where perhaps we're in a global innovation game with China. We're trying to figure out what's the next battery, the next magnet, and all that kind of stuff. And really what happens when China engages into export activities, right, restricting rare earths, is that the rest of the world sort of realizes how far ahead they really are in terms of developing those kinds of technologies. And really what you're seeing is a response to try and catch up to the frontier of research where they are, as opposed to sort of this cost mechanism that I think you have in your theory. But very nice, thank you.
Thank you. I really like the paper. I just want to touch on what Caroline was saying just now about looking at which industries in terms of export performance post the rare earth ban. You look at China and say that the innovation and the export performance is not significant after that, but how about solar panels industry? How about EV industries? Those China really capture the whole world, and those are using magnet, and that is the rare earth input into there. So perhaps the Chinese performance is better after the rare earth export ban, but somehow just not taken into account.
Related to Peter's question, it sort of seems to imply your model that they're, that on the flip side for the buyers, that are using these rare earth minerals, like they could have induced this innovation themselves, right? With some sort of, like just creating that wedge themselves, right? Through a tariff or something like that. I mean, you still see these welfare losses, so you might not have wanted to do that. But it's sort of, I think something that comes out of the model is that, you could sort of invert it to see, well, what Peter was saying, or this, like how could we sort of target tariffs to induce innovation as well? Thanks.
Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So these are all very great comments. Thank you, Caroline, for this fantastic discussion. So let me try to be quick and efficient. So yes, so governments can for sure direct innovation, and I think that also relates to these questions about subsidies. So that would be like the way that governments can do it. So when governments subsidize factor prices, then this induces an innovation response, and that's probably the way governments can make use of that mechanism. So Maggie, you asked already of whether we take account for that. So in the empirics, what we do as a control, I didn't mention it, is there is this global trade alert database which has subsidies. So it exists from essentially 2009 onwards, so it doesn't cover the whole period, but so we use it to control for this, and we see actually that at that time, those sectors like EVs are not heavily subsidized. So that happened actually quite later. And that also would be my reply to your comment about the increasing market share of Chinese EVs. Yes, for sure, that is happening, but that's also largely subsidy driven and happens after 2018 or just start. So this is not part of our sample frame. And I think it's not driven by induced technical change because of the supply, but actually subsidy-induced innovation. Solar panels is different because that's lithium. So lithium is not a rare earth, and therefore it was not part of these policy restrictions. So what can China do? So Peter, you asked about that. So my understanding of this whole thing is that, to be honest, China kind of misunderstood how strong the market could react by innovating itself out, and it was sort of a miscalculation by the government, and ultimately I think the Chinese party was surprised by that. So if they had known, probably they would not have done that. And in terms of innovation or level effect, so the type of innovation that we look at is something that is downstream. So like in this example, the GM patent about electric motors. So at that time, that was nothing where China was like cutting edge at the forefront of technologies. They were and still are at the forefront of how to refine and mine rare earth, but that's like the upstream part. The downstream using part, they were not. And again, like nowadays, because of subsidies, the whole situation might look different. But at that time, actually, China was not at a very, very high level. So I'm pretty confident that's not a level effect. But of course, ultimately, what we have to do is we count patents, and sometimes countries have different levels in what counts as an innovation that is patentable, and there might be differences in levels. So what we do in the empirics mostly is we do within country comparison between highly affected versus low affected industries. So to kind of get out of these like country differences. Yeah. Okay. So I hope I didn't miss anything. Oh yeah, I like this idea about self-induced innovation by restricting imports, by introducing trade policy instruments. Of course, that kind of implies that governments would have to fully understand all things going into comparative advantage and would have to kind of be able to trade off the innovation gain, which might be dynamic, we don't model it this way, versus terms of trade losses. And maybe that's not the first best policy, because maybe there's like smarter policies to achieve similar gains without incurring the terms of trade losses. But in principle, that is what the model would give us, yes. So I do appreciate the idea. Thank you.